March 7, 1945. A little after 1 in the afternoon, a wooded ridge above the Rhine, looking down on the German town of Remagen. A German engineer officer, named Karl Friesenhahn, is standing on the eastern bank of the river, beside a railway bridge that he has spent the morning preparing to destroy. He is a captain. He is a professional. He has done everything the manual told him to do. He has laid the charges. He has run the wires. He has tested the circuit, and the circuit tested clean. Across the river, American tanks are rolling into the streets of Remagen. The moment he has dreaded for weeks has finally come, and now there is only one thing left to do. He has to turn a key. He turns it. Nothing happens. He turns it again. Still nothing. The bridge that should be a cloud of smoke and falling steel is still standing. It is whole. It is intact. And on the far bank, the Americans have stopped staring at it and have started running toward it. Friesenhahn does not yet know that he is a dead man walking. He does not know that within a week, 4 German officers connected to this bridge will be stood against the trees of a quiet forest and shot in the back of the neck by their own army. He does not know that one of the highest field marshals in the German military is about to be fired in disgrace because of what is failing to happen in front of his eyes. He does not know that a special court will be sent racing toward this region with orders to find men to kill. He only knows that he turned the key, and the bridge did not fall. Why? Why did the demolition fail? And here is the stranger question, the one this whole story turns on. When the bridge did not fall, why did Adolf Hitler respond not by asking how the Americans had done it, but by hunting down his own men and killing them? That is the question. Hold on to it, because everything that follows is an attempt to answer it. This is the story of how the United States Army captured an intact bridge across the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland, on an afternoon when by every rule of war it should not have been possible. It is the story of how that single bridge may have shortened the war in Europe. But more than that, it is the story of what the German reaction to losing it reveals about the rot that had eaten into the German command system by the spring of 1945. Because the men Hitler executed were not traitors. Most of them were not even truly to blame. They were victims of a system that Hitler himself had built, a system designed to prevent one kind of catastrophe that instead guaranteed another. To understand why a German captain turned a key and nothing happened, and why men died for it, we cannot start on the 7th of March. We have to go back 5 months earlier, to a different bridge, in a different city, and to the moment Adolf Hitler decided that the way to stop his bridges from falling was to start shooting the men who guarded them. Let me take you back to October 1944. The city is Cologne. The Allied armies are closing on the western border of Germany, and the great question hanging over the German command is the Rhine. The Rhine is not just a river. In the German military imagination, it is the moat around the castle. It is wide, it is fast, and it is deep, and for centuries it had been the line that invaders could not easily cross. Every general on both sides understood that if the Allies got across the Rhine in strength, the war in the West was effectively over. So the German plan was simple in concept. Hold the West Bank as long as possible, then, at the last moment, blow every single bridge across the river and let the Rhine do the defending. The trouble was the timing. Blow a bridge too early, and you trap your own retreating armies on the wrong side, handing them to the enemy. Blow it too late and the enemy captures it intact and pours across. The entire defense of Germany came down to officers making one decision, at one moment, under fire, with the fate of the Reich hanging on whether they got the timing exactly right. And then, in October, an accident in Cologne poisoned that whole system. An American bomb, by sheer chance, struck the demolition chamber of a bridge over the Rhine at Cologne and set off its charges prematurely. The bridge dropped into the river before anyone had ordered it destroyed. To any rational observer, this was bad luck, a freak hit. But Hitler did not see bad luck. Hitler saw sabotage. He saw cowardice. He saw officers who could not be trusted with the most important structures in Germany. His response set the trap that would close on the men at Remagen 5 months later. Hitler issued ferocious new orders governing the demolition of Rhine bridges. From now on, the rules were these. Explosive charges were not to be placed on a bridge until the enemy was almost upon it, within a few miles. The order to prepare a bridge for demolition had to be given in writing. The order to actually blow the bridge also had to be given in writing by a named, authorized commander. And, crucially, the penalty for blowing a bridge too soon was death. An officer who destroyed a bridge prematurely, who lost his nerve and dropped it before the enemy truly arrived, would be court-martialed and shot. Now think carefully about what this did to the mind of a German bridge commander. He already knew that letting a bridge fall into enemy hands intact was a catastrophe that could end his career or his life. Now he also knew that blowing it 1 minute too early would put him in front of a firing squad. He was trapped between two fears. Wait too long and the enemy takes the bridge. Act too soon and your own side shoots you. The safest thing, the only thing that felt safe, was to wait. Wait for the written order. Wait for permission. Wait for someone higher up to take the decision out of your hands. Hitler had taken the most time-critical decision in the entire German defense and wrapped it in so much fear and paperwork that hesitation became the natural response of every honest officer. And there was a second order from the very top that pressed down on these men just as hard. Hitler had forbidden any general retreat behind the Rhine. He refused to accept that the war in the West was a matter of trading space for time. He wanted his soldiers to fight and hold on the western bank, not to slip across the river and prepare a clean defensive line on the far side. The professional soldiers knew this was madness. The sensible course was to pull the surviving units back over the Rhine, blow the bridges cleanly behind them, and force the Allies to fight their way across a wide and dangerous river. But Hitler would not allow it. So the German armies in the West were being ground to pieces on the wrong side of their own great moat, and the bridges had to be kept open longer than any rational plan would have allowed, to let those trapped men escape. Every order from above pulled in the same fatal direction. Keep the bridges standing. Do not act on your own. Wait for permission that, in the chaos of those final weeks, often came far too late or never came at all. This is the heart of what I want you to understand, and it is a theme we will come back to again and again. The German army of 1945 had not always been like this. Once, it had been the most flexible, fast-thinking fighting force on the planet. The German military tradition, going back more than a century, had been built on a famous idea. You told an officer what you wanted accomplished, the goal, the intent, and then you trusted him to work out how to do it himself. You did not stand over his shoulder. You did not demand written permission for every move. You pushed decisions down to the man on the spot, because the man on the spot could see the battlefield and you could not. This philosophy had conquered most of Europe in a handful of years. It was the secret engine of the early German victories, but by 1945, that engine had been deliberately broken. Hitler did not trust his generals anymore, and after the bomb plot against his life in July 1944, he trusted them even less. He had pulled decision-making upward, into his own hands, and into the hands of fanatics who answered only to him. He micromanaged battles from hundreds of miles away. He forbade retreats that every professional soldier knew were necessary. And with these new bridge orders, he took the timing of demolitions, a decision that could only sanely be made by the man standing on the bridge, and he buried it under a mountain of written authorizations and the threat of execution. He had taken an army that once ran on trust and rebuilt it to run on fear. Remember that. The whole tragedy of Remagen grows out of it. So now we come to the bridge itself. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was not a beautiful structure, but it was a serious one. It had been built during the First World War, between 1916 and 1919, partly with the labor of Russian prisoners of war. It had been designed by an engineer named Karl Wiener, and it was conceived not as a peacetime convenience, but as a military tool, one of several new Rhine crossings meant to speed German troops westward in a future war. It was named after General Erich Ludendorff, one of the German commanders of that earlier war, and a great champion of the project. It carried 2 railway tracks and walkways across the Rhine, stretching a little over 1,000 feet from bank to bank, a great structure of steel arches anchored on heavy stone piers and guarded at each end by thick stone towers with slits for riflemen. Those towers were not decoration. They were strongpoints, built so that the bridge could be defended by infantry and a body of troops could shelter and fight from inside them. On the eastern bank, the railway ran directly off the bridge and straight into a tunnel, bored almost at a right angle through a steep basalt hill called the Erpelele. That hill rose sharply above the river, and the tunnel running through it was wide and deep. That hill and that tunnel will matter later because they became both a refuge for the German defenders and a trap. Here is a detail that tells you something about German thoroughness and about the irony to come. When the bridge was first designed, the engineers built special hollow chambers into the stonework of the piers, cavities shaped to hold demolition charges, so that the bridge could be destroyed quickly in a future war. They built the means of its own destruction directly into its bones. But after the First World War, when French troops occupied the Rhineland, the French found those chambers and filled them with concrete, so the very feature meant to make the bridge easy to drop had been sealed shut decades before. By 1945, the Germans had to improvise their demolition, strapping charges to the girders and the piers from the outside, which was far less effective than a charge packed deep inside the structure. The bridge, in a sense, had been quietly armored against its own destruction long before the Americans ever arrived. By the early days of March 1945, the German defense west of the Rhine was collapsing. American and Allied armies were driving toward the river along a broad front in an operation aimed at clearing the entire West Bank. The American First Army, pushing down from the north, and General Patton's Third Army, driving in from another direction, were squeezing the German forces in the region between them, trapping tens of thousands of soldiers against the Rhine with their backs to the water. German units were being shattered, encircled, or pushed back in disorder. The roads east were clogged with retreating soldiers, horse-drawn carts, wounded men, and civilians, all trying to get across the Rhine before the bridges came down. Among the thousands of soldiers streaming toward Remagen were men who hoped to cross the Ludendorff Bridge to safety. The German command wanted to keep the bridge open as long as possible to let those troops escape. That desire, the very human, very reasonable desire to save retreating soldiers, was one more weight on the scale that argued for waiting before blowing the bridge. And it sat in direct, agonizing tension with the other half of the problem. Keep the bridge open to save your own men, and you risk the enemy seizing it. Blow it to deny the enemy, and you doom thousands of your own soldiers on the wrong bank. There was no clean answer, and the men at Remagen had to live inside that contradiction. The command situation at Remagen was a mess, and the mess is important, so let me lay it out plainly. There was no single clear boss. The defense of the bridge was split among men who did not fully answer to one another. There was an officer responsible for actually fighting, a combat commander, Captain Willy Bratschger. There was the engineer, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, responsible for the technical work of the demolition. There were anti-aircraft gunners from the Air Force who answered to their own chain. There were poorly armed Home Guard militia, older men and boys, who answered to local party officials. And in the days just before the 7th of March, the higher responsibility for the sector had been passed around between different headquarters in confusion. At one point, the corps commander responsible for the area literally drove into American lines by mistake and was captured. Responsibility for the bridge changed hands in the small hours of the morning of the 7th, with the Americans almost in sight. The corps that inherited the problem sent an officer to take command at the bridge. His name was Major Hans Scheller. He set out with a small staff and a radio team on a journey of around 40 miles through roads choked with retreat and chaos. He lost his radio team along the way. He did not arrive at Remagen until 11:15 on the morning of the 7th of March, less than 2 hours before the Americans appeared on the heights above the town. Pause on that. The man given final authority over whether and when to blow one of the last intact bridges over the Rhine arrived at his post with less than 2 hours to understand the situation, and he arrived with no working radio to talk to his superiors. He walked into a catastrophe already in motion, handed a decision wrapped in Hitler's deadly rules, and he had almost no time to make it. And the force he was supposed to command was barely a force at all. On paper, there were perhaps 1,000 men assigned to the defense of the bridge, but the reality was far weaker. There was a small group of convalescent soldiers, men recovering from wounds. There were the engineers under Captain Friesenhahn. There were teenage boys of the Hitler Youth, and there were older men of the Home Guard militia, many of whom simply slipped away as the Americans approached. There were anti-aircraft gunners and a scattering of foreign volunteers from the east. They had little heavy weaponry to stop a determined armored assault. Some of the militia melted into the countryside before the first shots were even fired. So the picture on the German side was not a strong garrison waiting behind a prepared demolition. It was a thin, confused, exhausted collection of odds and ends, with no clear single commander until the last possible moment, facing one of the most powerful armies on earth. Now, the Americans. The unit driving toward Remagen was Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, part of the United States First Army. Their commander was Brigadier General William Hogue. And here is the first thing to understand about the American side, because it is the exact mirror image of the German problem. The Americans were not under orders to take a bridge across the Rhine at Remagen. Their orders were to drive to the river, take the town, and then turn south to link up with another American army. Crossing the Rhine here was not the plan. If anything, Remagen was considered a poor place to cross, hemmed in by hills and difficult ground. On the morning of the 7th of March, an advance party of American scouts pushed through the woods and came out on a ridge, looking down at the town and the river. And there, impossibly, was the bridge, still standing, intact, crowded with German soldiers and vehicles streaming across it to the eastern bank. For a moment, the Americans on that ridge could hardly believe what they were seeing. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been dropped into the water as the Allies approached. The German plan was working everywhere else, but here, at Remagen, the great steel structure still spanned the river, and the enemy was using it to escape before their eyes. Word went up the chain to General Hogue, and Hogue made a decision that defines everything that this story is about. He did not radio his superiors and ask for permission to change his mission. He did not wait for written orders. He did not hesitate over the fact that taking the bridge was not what he had been told to do, and that if it went wrong, if the bridge blew up with his men on it, or if he was charging into a deadly trap, it could end his career. He looked at the intact bridge, understood in an instant what it was worth, and ordered his men to take it. Later, he called it probably the greatest turning point in his whole career as a soldier. He acted on his own judgment, on the spot, and took the risk onto his own shoulders. Think about the gamble he was making. The bridge might be wired to explode the moment his men set foot on it. It might be a deliberate trap, left standing to lure American troops onto the span and then detonated beneath them. Sending soldiers across could mean sending them to a pointless death. And even if they made it, he would have committed his force across the Rhine, in a place his own high command had never planned to cross, possibly throwing the entire Allied campaign off its careful schedule. A more cautious commander would have radioed back, described the situation, and asked what to do. By the time the answer came, the Germans would almost certainly have finished the job and dropped the bridge. Hogue understood that the only way to seize the opportunity was to seize it now, himself, without asking. So he did. That is the German military philosophy of the previous century, the one built on trust and initiative, being practiced to perfection by an American general, at the very moment the Germans across the river were paralyzed by fear and waiting for written permission. The two armies had quietly traded places. The job of actually crossing the bridge fell to a company of armored infantry led by a young second lieutenant named Karl Timmermann. And there is no more fitting man in this entire story because of who he was. Karl Timmermann was 22 years old. He had been given command of his company only the night before, and he had been born in Germany. His father had been an American soldier stationed in Germany after the First World War, a man who went absent without leave, married a German woman, and eventually brought his family back to the small town of West Point in the American state of Nebraska. So the first American officer to lead troops onto a bridge across the Rhine, into the German homeland, was a man born on German soil, the son of a soldier who had once disgraced his own uniform. Karl had joined the army in part to redeem the family name. Now he stood at the western end of the Ludendorff Bridge, looking at a structure that the enemy might detonate under his feet at any second. His major asked him, "Do you think you can get your company across that bridge?" Timmerman answered simply that they could try. When he asked what would happen if the bridge blew up in his face, he got no answer, because there was no answer. There was only the bridge, and the order to cross it. Now let us put the two clocks side by side, because the timing is everything. On the eastern bank, Captain Friesenhahn was trying to carry out the demolition under Hitler's suffocating rules. He had wanted around 1,300 pounds of military-grade explosive to do the job properly. What he actually received, late, was only about 660 pounds of a weaker industrial explosive, the kind used in mining and quarrying, not the powerful military charges he needed. He had to make do. He placed what he had on one of the main piers, lashing the charges to the steel where he judged they would do the most harm. He knew it was not enough. He was a trained engineer, and he could see that the explosive he had been given was the wrong tool for bringing down a bridge of this size and strength. But it was what he had, and the enemy was coming. Then came the ritual of permission that Hitler's orders demanded, and this is where the system Hitler built reached down and strangled the men trying to obey it. The combat commander had to receive the written demolition order from Major Scheller, the officer who had arrived only hours before. Then the engineer, Friesenhahn, demanded that the order be passed to him in writing as well, because he knew that to blow the bridge on his own word, without the paperwork, could see him shot for acting without authority. Every honest, careful, by-the-book step took time, and time was the one thing they did not have, because the Americans were already at the bridge. Picture it. The enemy is pouring into the town on the far bank. The engineer is ready, the charges are placed, and the men are passing slips of paper back and forth, because the dictator's rules have made a signature more important than a second. At one point, Friesenhahn set off a smaller charge meant to blow a crater in the approach ramp on the western side, to slow the American tanks and infantry. The blast tore a hole in the ramp, but the concussion also caught Friesenhahn himself and knocked him unconscious for around 15 minutes. He came to, dazed and ringing, and made his way back to the firing point, which was set in the shelter of the railway tunnel through the basalt hill. Finally, with the Americans swarming the western end, the written orders given at last, he received the command to blow the bridge. He turned the firing key. Nothing. He turned it again. Nothing. The main charge did not fire. The circuit that had tested perfectly was now dead. Why did it fail? This is one of the genuine mysteries of the war, and I am going to be honest with you about the limits of what we know, because this story has enough real drama that it does not need invented certainty. The official American history treats the cause as never fully resolved. The most widely believed explanation, held by many of the Germans who were there, is that an American shell, probably from a tank, had struck the bridge and severed the cable carrying the firing current, cutting the circuit at the worst possible moment. American engineers later found that one of the protective conduits carrying the wires had indeed been cut. There were also suggestions of sabotage, that some unwilling laborer or soldier had tampered with the connections, but this was never proven, and once the bridge later fell into the Rhine, the physical evidence was gone forever. What is certain is that the explosive itself was the wrong type and far too little. Even when a backup was tried, the charge that did go off was simply not powerful enough to do the job. Because Friesenhahn did not give up. When the key failed, a volunteer was called for, a man to run out onto the bridge, under American fire, and light the backup ignition by hand. A non-commissioned officer named Anton Faust ran out across the open bridge, found the primer, and lit it. This time there was an explosion, a real one. The watching Germans saw the great bridge heave upward as the charge detonated. Timbers and dust flew. For a heartbeat, it must have looked like success. Then the smoke cleared, and the bridge was still there. The blast had lifted it, twisted some of its steelwork, torn a gap in part of the structure, but the well-built bridge had settled back onto its piers, wounded but standing. the weak industrial explosive, the inadequate amount, the sealed demolition chambers from decades before, all of it added up to a bridge that simply would not die. On the western bank, the Americans saw the explosion too. They saw the bridge rise and fall and survive, and the engineers among them understood at once what it meant. If the Germans had tried their main demolition and failed, the bridge might not blow again. The window was open, but it could slam shut at any second if the Germans rigged another charge. There was no time to deliberate. This is the second great act of initiative on the American side, and it came not from a general, but from ordinary soldiers. As Timmerman's infantry began to move out onto the bridge, a small group of combat engineers ran out with them, and ahead of them, led by Lieutenant Hugh Mott, with Sergeants Eugene Dorland and John Reynolds. Their job, which no detailed order had spelled out for them in that moment, was obvious to them. The bridge was wired to explode, so they would cut the wires. Under fire, out on the open span above the cold rushing Rhine, these men climbed along the girders, found the demolition cables, and cut them. They located charges and pried them loose and threw them into the river. Sergeant Dorland used his rifle and his hands to destroy the main connection. They were defusing the bridge by hand while infantry advanced around them and German fire came down on them. No one had to tell them to do it. They saw what needed doing and they did it, on their own authority, at the risk of their lives. Again, the same pattern. Decisions made by the man on the spot, trusted to act without waiting for permission. The infantry pushed across in rushes, moving from girder to girder, expecting at every step to be blown into the sky. The American tanks on the western bank fired across the river to suppress the German positions, and the new heavy tanks among them, the most powerful the Americans had, hammered the stone towers and the far bank to keep the defenders' heads down. A sergeant named Alexander Drabick, a former butcher from the state of Ohio, became the first American across the Rhine, the first hostile soldier to cross that river in strength since the time of Napoleon, more than a century before. He ran the last stretch flat out, stumbling, certain the bridge would erupt under him, and reached the eastern bank alive. Karl Timmerman, the German-born lieutenant, was the first American officer across. On the far side, they fought their way into the stone tower and up the slope of the Erpel Allee, the basalt hill, clearing out machine gun nests and taking prisoners. A sergeant named Joseph Delisio climbed into the eastern tower and captured a German machine gun crew that had been firing down on the bridge. Inside the railway tunnel through the hill, the German defenders and a crowd of civilians who had taken shelter there were trapped, and many soon surrendered. The Americans were across the Rhine, on the eastern bank, in the German heartland, and the bridge behind them was standing. By midnight, only a small force, around 120 men, held the eastern bank. But they held it, and behind them, American commanders were already grasping what had happened and pouring everything they could toward the bridge. Now, here is where the story turns from triumph on one side to horror on the other. Because while the Americans were celebrating a miracle, the German High Command was looking for someone to kill. The news reached Hitler's headquarters and detonated like a bomb. The Allies had a bridge across the Rhine. The moat had been breached. The one thing the entire Western defense had been built to prevent had happened, and it had happened because of a demolition that failed and a chain of command that hesitated. Hitler's reaction was not analysis, it was fury, and it was vengeance. He moved immediately against the top. He relieved the most senior German commander in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most respected soldiers in the German army, and replaced him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Rundstedt was a professional of the old school, a man whose reputation went back decades, and he was cast aside in disgrace over a bridge he had never personally seen. But firing a field marshal was not enough to satisfy Hitler. He wanted blood lower down. He wanted the men closest to the bridge, the ones who had actually failed to blow it, to pay with their lives. And so he reached for one of the darkest instruments of the dying Reich. He ordered the creation of a special, mobile court-martial, a so-called flying court-martial, whose job was to travel to the area, find the officers responsible, try them on the spot, and execute them. Speed was the point. There would be no lengthy investigation, no real defense, no appeal. To run this court, he chose a general named Rudolf Hübner. Hübner was not a trained lawyer. By background, he was, of all things, a dentist, and he was known above all for his fanatical loyalty to the regime. He was exactly the kind of man Hitler now preferred, a true believer who would not be troubled by legal niceties. Hübner would act as judge and prosecutor at once. He was given a small panel of fellow officers to sit with him, and a pair of military policemen to serve as the firing squad. The court would travel, find its victims, and kill them. There is a moment that captures the whole spirit of this court. The headquarters of the army group in the area had a properly trained legal officer, a real military jurist, who offered Hübner a copy of the German military legal code, the actual book of law that was supposed to govern courts-martial. Hübner brushed it aside. He said, in effect, that the only authority he needed was the will of the Führer. The law was irrelevant. Hitler wanted men dead, and Hübner's purpose was to make them dead, with just enough ceremony to call it justice. Let me tell you now about the men this court hunted, because they deserve to be more than a number. And let me be precise about who lived and who died, because this is exactly the kind of fact that careless tellings get wrong, and I promised you the truth. The first and most prominent target was Major Hans Scheller. Scheller was the officer sent at the last moment to take command of the bridge, the man who arrived with less than 2 hours to spare and no working radio. In the eyes of the court, he was the responsible commander, and so he carried the heaviest blame, even though he had been handed an impossible situation already spinning out of control. Scheller was tried before Hübner's court and condemned. He was shot on the 13th of March 1945 in a wood near a place called Rimbach, in the hills east of the Rhine. The official notice later sent to his widow recorded coldly that the sentence had been carried out that same day in the woods, about a kilometer from the village. The second man shot that same day was a younger officer, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters. Peters was an Air Force officer who had commanded a special rocket weapon battery in the area. His supposed crime was connected to letting secret equipment fall into enemy hands. He too was condemned by the court and shot near Rimbach on the 13th of March. The next day, the 13th having claimed 2 men, the court moved and claimed 2 more. On the 14th of March, at another village in the same forested region, 2 further officers were tried and executed. One was Major Herbert Strobel, an engineer staff officer responsible for the sector that included the bridge. The other was Major August Kraft, who had commanded the engineer battalion involved in preparing the demolition, and who had actually been miles away from the bridge when it was captured. Both were stood against the trees and shot. 4 men: Major Scheller, Lieutenant Peters, Major Strobel, Major Kraft. Some accounts place all 4 killings on the single day of the 14th of March, but the most careful records, including the grave records of the men themselves, point to the 2 days, the 13th and the 14th. Either way, the essential fact is the same. 4 officers of the German army, killed not by the enemy, but by their own side, on the personal fury of their head of state, for failing to destroy a bridge under conditions that had been made nearly impossible by that same head of state's own orders. They were shot in the back of the neck. They were buried where they fell. Their last letters home were reportedly burned, and in keeping with the regime's practice of punishing families, the pension rights of their relatives were stripped away, only to be restored long after the war. Now here is the part that reveals the true cruelty and randomness of it all, and it is essential to get right. 2 other officers were marked by this affair, and their fates show how arbitrary the whole thing was. One was Captain Willy Bratke, the combat commander at the bridge, the man who had been fighting on the ground. He was condemned to death as well, sentenced in his absence. But the court could not carry out his sentence, for one simple reason. Bratke had been captured by the Americans. He was already a prisoner of war, safe on the other side of the lines. He had been condemned to death by his own country, but his enemy's captivity is what saved his life. He survived the war. The other was Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer, the very man who turned the key, the man we met at the beginning of this story standing on the eastern bank as the bridge refused to fall. You might think he, of all people, the man whose demolition failed, would be first against the wall. But he was not executed. He was acquitted. Even Hübner's travelling court of vengeance could see that Friesenhahn had done everything humanly possible. He had laid his charges with the wrong, weak explosive in the wrong amount, far too late, and against impossible odds. He had set off the backup by hand when the key failed. He had sent a man running out under fire to light the charge. The failure was not his, and like Bracher, he had ended up in American hands. He survived. Sit with that contrast for a moment, because it is the whole story in miniature. The engineer who actually pressed the button and failed was spared, because the court grudgingly admitted he had done his duty. But the staff major who had been 40 miles away, and the lieutenant with the rocket battery, and above all the exhausted major who arrived with 2 hours and no radio, those men were shot. The punishment fell not on the man most responsible for the technical failure, but on the men who happened to be within reach, who could be caught, tried in minutes, and killed to satisfy a dictator's rage. It was not justice, it was theatre. It was the regime performing its own ferocity for an audience of terrified survivors. And that word, audience, is the key to what these killings were really for. The executions were not meant to fix anything. The bridge was already lost. The Americans were already across. Killing 4 officers in a forest could not pull the bridge back out of American hands or push the enemy back over the river. The killings had a different purpose, and it was a purpose aimed not at the past but at the future, at every other German officer still holding a position somewhere along the crumbling front. After the men were shot, word of what had happened was deliberately spread through the German forces. The executions were publicized within the army as a warning, so that every officer who might one day face a similar choice would know exactly what waited for him if he failed. It was a warning written in the blood of 4 men. Hold your position, blow your bridge on time, do not fail, because if you do, we will not ask about your circumstances, we will not weigh the impossible situation you were placed in, we will simply find you and shoot you. The deaths of Scheller, Peters, Strobel, and Kraft were a message, broadcast to a frightened army, that the price of failure was now your life, no matter the reason for it. That is what a regime does when it has run out of every other tool. It rules by fear because it has nothing else left. And that points us to the deepest reason these executions happened at all, and why they tell us so much about the state of the German army in 1945. The German army had once been the most effective fighting force in the world, precisely because it trusted its officers to think. The whole tradition was built on the idea that the man on the spot, the captain or the major standing in the smoke and the noise, understood his piece of the battle better than any distant headquarters, and so he should be empowered to act on his own judgment. An order, the old German thinking went, that no longer fit the reality in front of you, was an order you were expected to set aside in order to accomplish what your commander truly wanted. There is a famous old saying from the German tradition, in which a prince scolds an officer for a mistake, and the officer protests that he was only following orders, and the prince replies that he was made an officer precisely so that he would know when not to obey. That was the soul of the old German army. Initiative, trust, judgment pushed downward to the men who could see. By 1945, that soul was dead, and Hitler had killed it. Across the war, especially after the disasters in the East and the bomb plot against his life, Hitler had steadily stripped his officers of the right to think. He demanded that decisions flow upward to him. He forbade retreats. He ordered men to stand and die in place rather than give ground, choices that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. He surrounded himself with loyalists and fanatics rather than professional soldiers who might tell him the truth. And in the specific matter of the bridges, he had taken the single most time-sensitive decision a frontline officer could face, the instant of demolition, and he had buried it under written orders and the threat of death. So at Remagen, you had German officers who were almost incapable of acting without permission, because acting without permission had been made lethal, while across the river you had American officers and sergeants and ordinary soldiers acting on their own judgment at every level, a general changing his mission on sight, a lieutenant leading men onto a bridge that might explode, engineers cutting wires by hand without being told. The Americans had, without any grand theory about it, become the flexible, trusting, initiative-driven army that Germany had once been, and the Germans, the original masters of that idea, had been twisted by their own dictator into a frightened bureaucracy that waited for orders and then shot the men who waited too long. The executions at Remagen were not a strong army punishing failure. They were a broken army devouring itself. A healthy military learns from a defeat. A sick one looks for someone to shoot. Hitler shot a field marshal's career and 4 officers' lives, and he learned nothing, because the lesson, that his own system of fear had lost the bridge, was the one thing he could never allow himself to see. While Hitler was hunting his own officers, the Americans were doing something very different with the bridge. They were using it. The reaction on the Allied side, once the news climbed the chain, was a scramble to exploit the gift. There is a well-known account of the moment the senior American leadership heard. When General Omar Bradley was told the bridge had been captured intact, he was elated, and when a planning officer objected that the bridge was in the wrong place, that it did not fit the grand plan for crossing the Rhine farther north, Bradley's response was blunt. He asked what on earth they were supposed to do, pull back and blow it up themselves. Eisenhower's headquarters, despite the bridge not fitting the master plan, recognized what they had. Eisenhower's own chief of staff is said to have called the bridge worth its weight in gold, a line often attributed to Eisenhower himself as well. Orders went out to rush troops across and build up the bridgehead on the eastern bank. For 10 days the Germans threw everything they had at that bridge, in a desperate attempt to do what the failed demolition had not. They shelled it with artillery, which did the most damage of all, pounding the span and the bridgehead around the clock. They sent aircraft against it, day after day, wave after wave, and the Americans counted hundreds of German air attacks over those 10 days. Mostly beaten back by a wall of anti-aircraft guns, the Americans had rushed to the riverbanks, one of the heaviest concentrations of such guns they assembled anywhere in the war. They fired some of the most exotic weapons in their arsenal at it. They sent jet bombers, among the first jet aircraft ever used to attack a target like this, streaking in too fast for the defenses to easily track. They brought up enormous siege artillery, including a giant mortar designed to smash fortresses. They even fired a number of their V-2 rockets, the giant ballistic missiles, at the bridge. It was the only time those rockets were ever used against such a tactical target, and the only time they were ever aimed at a target on German soil. The rockets were wildly inaccurate at that range. None of them hit the bridge, though they killed soldiers and civilians nearby, a reminder that the weapon was a terror device, not a precision tool. The Germans even sent combat swimmers down the cold river at night, special forces trained to plant charges against the piers, though by the time they made their attempt, the original bridge had already fallen and they were turned against the American pontoon bridges built nearby. They too failed, picked out of the dark water by powerful searchlights, a secret piece of equipment that the Americans trained across the surface of the Rhine. Every method failed. The bridge, which would not fall when the Germans wanted it to, now would not fall no matter how hard they tried to bring it down. The bridge held under all of this long enough for American engineers to build other crossings, sturdy pontoon and floating bridges right alongside it, so that even when the original bridge was gone, the flow of men and machines would not stop, and the flow was enormous. In the days after the capture, tens of thousands of American troops, with their tanks and guns and trucks, poured across the Rhine at Remagen and fanned out into the heartland of Germany. Well over 100,000 men crossed in those first days, across the bridge and the new crossings beside it, 6 divisions establishing themselves on the far bank. And then, on the 17th of March, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally died. Not from German bombs or shells or rockets, but from its own wounds. The failed demolition, the constant pounding, the relentless traffic, and the strain of war had weakened it beyond saving. As American engineers worked on the structure, trying to keep it standing, the bridge suddenly gave way and collapsed into the Rhine. Engineers who were on it and around it were thrown into the cold, fast water. 28 American engineers were killed, by the most careful count, though some accounts put the number higher, and dozens more were injured in the collapse. Many of the dead were never recovered, swept away by the swift current of the river. It is a bitter irony that the bridge, having survived everything the enemy could throw at it, finally killed the very men who had been trying to save it. But by then it no longer mattered for the outcome. The other bridges were up. The Americans were across the Rhine to stay. There is one more part of this story that needs telling, because it is the part where, after the war, something like justice was attempted. The man who had run the flying court, the dentist-turned-executioner Rudolf Hübner, did not vanish into the wreckage of the defeated Reich. After the war, he was brought before a German court at Koblenz to answer for what he had done to those officers. He was tried and convicted, and sentenced to 4 years in prison, a punishment that many would consider far too light for the killings he had carried out. He had hidden behind the claim that he was only doing the Führer's will, the same excuse offered by so many others, and that excuse did not save the men he had condemned, but it softened his own reckoning. For the families of the dead, the fight was longer and far more painful. The men shot in those forests had been branded as cowards and failures by the regime that killed them. Their names carried that shame. Their widows had been stripped of their pensions and left to carry the weight of an official verdict of cowardice and dereliction. And so, for years after the war, there was an effort, led above all by the widow of Major Scheller, to clear these names, to have the verdicts of that travelling court recognized for what they were, not lawful judgments but murders, dressed up as justice. In time, that effort succeeded. The death sentences handed down by Hübner's court were formally overturned, and the officers were posthumously rehabilitated, their honor restored on paper if not in life. It was decades too late for the men themselves, who lay in their graves in the German soil they had died trying to defend. But it mattered. It was the law returning at last to say that what had been done to them was wrong. So let us return, finally, to the question we started with. Captain Friesenhahn turned the key, and the bridge did not fall, and Hitler responded by killing his own men. Why? The simplest answer is that the demolition failed for ordinary, miserable reasons. The wrong explosive in the wrong amount, supplied too late. A firing circuit broken at the worst possible moment, most likely by a stray American shell. Demolition chambers sealed with concrete by Frenchmen decades earlier. A backup charge too weak to finish the job. A command structure so confused that the responsible officer arrived with 2 hours to spare and no radio. There was no single villain. There was only friction, bad luck, and a hopeless situation. But the deeper answer, the one that matters, is about why men died for it. Hitler executed his own officers because he had built an army that could not tell him the truth, and could no longer think for itself. And the only tool such a system has when it fails is to find someone to blame and kill them. The very orders meant to protect the bridges, the written authorizations, and the death penalty for acting too soon were what guaranteed the fatal hesitation. Hitler had created the trap, and when his own men fell into it, he shot them for falling. The men who were executed, Scheller, Peters, Strobel and Kraft, were not cowards, and they were not traitors. They were soldiers caught in an impossible machine, who happened to be within reach of an executioner's pistol when their leader needed someone to punish. The man most directly connected to the failure, the engineer Friesenhahn, was spared because even a court of vengeance could see he had done his duty. The combat commander Bratscher was saved only by the enemy's captivity. There is no clearer proof that these killings were about rage and fear rather than justice. The punishment did not follow the failure, it followed whoever could be caught. And on the other bank, the Americans had shown what the German army had lost. A general who changed his orders on sight and took the risk himself. A young, German-born lieutenant who walked his men onto a bridge that might erupt beneath them. Engineers who cut the wires with their own hands because they could see it needed doing and did not wait to be told. That was the spirit the German army had once owned and that Hitler had strangled. The bridge at Remagen did not just open a road across the Rhine, it exposed, in a single afternoon, the difference between an army that trusted its men and an army that had learned to fear its leader. The men who took that bridge mostly went home and faded back into ordinary lives. Karl Timmermann, the lieutenant born on German soil who led the way across, stayed in the army after the war, But he did not grow old. He died of cancer in 1951, only a few years after Remagen, still a young man in his late 20s. Alexander Drabik, the butcher who was first across the Rhine, lived for many more years before dying in an ordinary traffic accident on an ordinary road. They were not larger than life. They were men who, in one moment, looked at a thing that had to be done and decided that the one to do it was them. And the men who died in the woods near Rimbach, shot by their own army for a bridge they could not have saved, deserve to be remembered too, not as cowards, which is what the regime called them, and not as heroes, which would be too easy, but as a warning. They are what happens when fear replaces trust at the heart of an army and a nation. They were killed to send a message to everyone still in uniform, that failure would not be forgiven, and that the only safety lay in blind, frightened obedience. It was the message of a dying regime, and it could not save it. Within weeks, the Reich that shot them was itself dead. That is the real answer to why Hitler executed his own officers after the Americans took the bridge at Remagen intact. He did it because, by the spring of 1945, killing his own men was the only thing his broken system still knew how to do well. The bridge was a gift to the Americans, but it was something else to the Germans. It was a mirror, and the reflection staring back, of an army turned against itself, of a leader who answered failure with murder, told the truth about how completely the war was already lost. The bridge itself was never rebuilt. To this day, the great stone towers still stand on both banks of the Rhine at Remagen, the towers where Sergeant Delisio climbed to capture a machine gun crew, the towers that watched the whole thing happen. They rise out of the riverbank with nothing between them now, a bridge to nowhere, the span long gone into the water and into history. The towers on the western side hold a quiet museum today, dedicated to peace. They are all that is left of the structure that, for 10 days in March 1945, became the most important bridge in the world, and the place where the difference between two armies, one that trusted its men and one that had learned to fear its leader, was written in steel and in blood and in the lives of the men who crossed it and the men who died because it would not fall. If this story held your attention, and if you believe these men, on both sides of that river, deserve to be remembered accurately, with the real names and the real details and the uncomfortable truths left in, then consider subscribing, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. History does not need to be exaggerated to be extraordinary. It only needs to be told honestly. Thank you for listening, and until the next story, take care.